at that. Mr. Albas, we'll give you about 5.5 to balance it up.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Minister, for coming in today. Just further to Mr. Poilievre's comments, have you read Animal Farm?
I read voraciously. That's a book that I've read in
Okay,
my
well, in that case, you would know exactly why many Canadians, because many Canadians have read Animal Farm, and in it, one of the statements is all animals are equal. And then there's a little sub-paragraph that goes under that that says, but some animals are more equal than others. Mr. Poilievre has presented arguments in the House. He's presented them openly on his website. He's done them here today, saying that you are actually creating different approaches to passive investments for different types of taxpayers. Are some taxpayers or corporations more equal than others?
What we're clearly trying to do is to make sure that as we look at the tax code, that we ensure that the system doesn't encourage behavior that creates unfair outcomes, that doesn't enable the wealthiest to have bigger and bigger advantages as they get more wealthy. Advantages that aren't available to other Canadians, middle-class Canadians. We've identified what we understand based on the evidence to be some very big opportunities for people to plan their affairs, to defer much, much more tax than would be available for other Canadians. We think it's important to move forward. We think that it will enable us to make sure that our business sector is investing in their business and that people can have confidence that the system is fair.
Well, Mr. Minister, again, when you do not acknowledge the criticisms, both in the public sphere as well as what happens in the House of Commons, if you do not acknowledge that these things are there, you are not perceived to be listening. Now, some people have described this consultation period, dropped in the middle of summer, as a drive-by consultation. And people are angry. Are you proud of this approach you've taken, or do you have some regret for it?
Mr. Chair, happy to talk about the approach that we've taken to tax fairness. We ran in 2015 saying that we saw that the increase in the number of Canadian-controlled private corporations was driven by the objective of some people to use them as tax planning vehicles. We, in Budget 2016, identified the need for an expert council in order to evaluate where those advantages were. So then we spent the better part of a year looking at what were the biggest opportunities for people for tax planning, not available to others. So in Budget 2017, we identified 3 measures that we think are critically important to look at. And the outcome of that, of course, is where we are now. We've got a consultation that's going forward. And the good part about that is that we get to get feedback. So we've got draft legislation for 2 of the measures that we're talking about. We're getting feedback. There's important things that we're hearing that will allow us to make sure we get this right. We've got a 3rd measure that we don't have draft legislation yet.
When you don't answer the question, it gets people uptight and angry. Do you regret it?
Clearly, Mr. Chair, we are moving forward on an approach that we think is really going to make an important difference.
Okay. Now, in Kelowna, the Prime Minister said, speaking of tax changes, I want to be clear. People who make $50,000 a year should not pay higher taxes than people who make $250,000 a year. We've had tax experts, again, in the public sphere, we've had tax experts in front of this committee that says that cannot happen. Minister, that's misinformation. Who's right here? Is the Prime Minister right? Or are tax experts who work with Canadian small businesses every day with our tax code correct?
Mr. Chair, happy to think about some specific examples. Here's a good one. So if you're in our country earning $230,000 and you're a professional, your tax rate would be about 36% if you're not sprinkling income to your family members. If, on the other hand, you're incorporated as a professional and you sprinkle income to a couple of adult children and your spouse, you'll end up with a 20.5% tax rate. So let's think about what that means. That means for the person at the 20.5% tax rate that they'll take home at the end of the year about $180,000 or more. for the other person who's not sprinkling income to members of their family who aren't doing anything in the business, they'll instead have about $180,000. So, you know, there's a situation. Sorry, did I get $180,000 if you're a sprinkling income, and $150,000 if you're not. So, these are the sort of inequities in our system that we know don't make sense.
Minister, your own document says the TOSI, the tax on split income
Dan,
rules.
you will get one more question. Is that your answer, Minister?
I'm happy to have him ask more questions.
Okay, one more question.
So in your own consultation paper, it says that the CRA is not winning in court enough. And what you said about the TOSI rules about adult children receiving, we already have those rules in place that prohibit that kind of activity below age 18. But I'd like to ask you one question. At the Chamber of Commerce, after you did your press conference, the CEO of the Saskatchewan Chamber of Commerce said that you owed small business in this great country an apology because you've branded many of them as tax cheats, as people who do not care about the rest of the country, who are somehow freeloading at the expense of others. Minister, the floor is yours. Apologize if you feel it's the right thing to do.
Mr. Minister, your response.
Mr. Speaker, I think it's very important that we move forward in a measured way with approaches to our tax system that make sure that it's fair. Our approach is to identify the things that we think should be considered for the future, and that's what we're doing. The approach that people have taken in the past is entirely legitimate. It's based on tax rules that exist. What we're saying is that to make sure the system is fair for the long term, we can't allow advantages to grow and grow and grow, and that's what we're doing. And we think that what Canadians will see is an increased amount of investment in business across the country, and what they'll see is that for the next generation of entrepreneurs, a fair system that allows them to be successful. For professionals, an ability to incorporate for the right reasons, and that will benefit all of us.
Last question.